Shalom. Those of us who look at the events of our day and age and remember the stories of the Bible are quick to find parallels. And many of us are finding parallels between this year, 2020, and the stories of the Israelites in the wilderness. As is the case today, the Israelites of those days faced a new and a hostile environment. Often their enemies were unseen until it was too late. We have COVID-19. They had snakes and scorpions hiding under the rocks. Human enemies, too, were invisible until too late. The Amalekite tribes dogged our ancestors, picking off the weak and the straggling. Brave Joshua, heading the rookie army of recently freed slaves, weakened that fierce foe but did not eliminate the threat, and it continued to appear from generation to generation. Does that not echo with relevance? But today I hope to guide you on a Bible walk that goes beyond surface similarities. Let us look at the larger arc of historical experience in the Bible, from slavery to Sinai and its commitment to live the covenanted life, to sojourning in the wilderness for a generation, and finally to settlement in the Promised Land. Slavery, Sinai, sojourning, settlement. This is the story of two generations, not of one only. Why should that have been the case? Why didn't the children of Israel, those who experienced the Exodus and received the Ten Commandments, why didn't they see the homeland of Israel? Why was it their own children who fulfilled the destiny? What is the message of that multi-generational saga? We can see how this speaks to us when we contemplate the historical changes we are living through. Those changes themselves are, in many cases, the fruit of a multi-generational process of development. To switch focus in this way, think about the larger arc of the Bible story and the longer arc of our history. Let's remember something truly fundamental about the religious revolution of monotheism. Jews differed from the pagan polytheists of antiquity not only in arithmetic. It wasn't only a matter of one God rather than many. One God is also different in essence. Like the ancient pagans, our ancestors experienced God in the continuities of nature. They saw God's power in the wind and the tides, in the rising and setting of the sun, in the life cycle of plants, animals, and humans. But we also see God in the workings of history, in human affairs. That sets us apart. This is a profound difference. It means that we see the finger of God not only in the continuities of nature, but also in the discontinuities of expectation. The unfailing tides, the rising of the sun and its setting, the succession of the seasons, the stars going across the sky, these are one window into the transcendent. But our faith teaches us that in our human lives, we can sometimes just barely perceive that the opposite of stasis can also be a window opening into the workings of divinity. Changes in human affairs as well as unchanging laws of nature. these too can be the finger of God. The helm adjustments of our ship of state, the repair of our moral compass once we look at it anew and belatedly see that it has been compromised, these shifts from the status quo can also signify the power of God at work. This is why, in 2020, a notably conservative Supreme Court decides that people are people, regardless of whom they love, and as such, deserve their human rights. This is why, in 2020, monuments to racism, invulnerable to criticism for decades, suddenly come down, even with the police standing by. This is why, in 2020, sports team logos and mascots, criticized as dehumanizing by Native American groups, having remained unchanged for decades, are then retired over the course of just a few weeks. This is why in 2020, respected leaders of the military, trained and restrained in the structure of the chain of command, find their voices, one after another, to remind the country that still more fundamental than the commander who gives the order is the moral matrix justifying or invalidating any order given by any commander. This is our reality this week and this month. It can also help us understand the core story of our Jewish tradition, the story of Exodus, Revelation, journey, and homeland. We've been pondering the question, why 40 years? Why did God not immediately fulfill the promise to take the slaves home again to the land of the patriarchs and the matriarchs? From the perspective of history, we come to understand generational change takes a generation. But then when it is complete, things can change quickly. The Israelites of the Exodus generation thought like slaves. They left the house of slavery, but slavery remained in the houses of their minds. That's why they crumpled when faced by challenges. Moses had liberated them from Pharaoh, but their unhealthy dependence on Moses showed their lack of true independence. This problem surfaced immediately. The waters of Marah were bitter, so the people complained to Moses. Moses found a native wood that served to purify the waters. Why were the resources of the environment invisible to everyone else? We can understand that the Israelites were familiar with the ecosystem of Goshen in the northeast Nile Delta and not the arid environment of the Sinai, which Moses knew from his years of tending Jethro's flock. But no one asked Moses to share his shepherd knowledge. They didn't think that using their God-given intelligence, they could address their own problems. They didn't have that hallmark of freedom in their thinking. The golden calf episode was another sign of unhealthy dependence. Why did the Israelites clamor for Aaron to build the idol? They weren't trying to rebel against God. They still proclaimed that God had taken them out of Egypt, but they didn't understand a God who was beyond depiction. Moses, they could understand. They had said yes to God at Sinai, but a moment later, their more fundamental weakness re-emerged, and they asked Moses to speak to them. They weren't able, they said, to survive hearing God's immediate voice. Moses obliged them. It was disquieting to them and then completely destabilizing when Moses disappeared into the cloud sheathing the mountaintop. They could accept in their head an invisible God, but they couldn't accept it in their heart. They needed the visible symbol, Moses, Moses became their idol. In his absence, they wanted an idol of gold. Given this characteristic flaw, it's not surprising that upon receiving the report of 10 out of the 12 scouts that the Canaanites were invincible, that the Israelites concluded that the situation was hopeless. Never having learned to stand on their own feet, they couldn't see beyond the low horizons of their fearfulness. Caleb and Joshua, the two scouts who urged the people to press forward, were outliers. They represented a psychology whose time hadn't yet come. In retrospect, it's understandable that this was the tipping point. The Israelites had demonstrated that they didn't have the independence of spirit to survive as an independent people in the arena of Canaan. They could see no way forward, and their only counsel was to go backwards, back to Egypt, back to slavery. God was not going to allow that. As it says in the book of Psalms, Min hametzar karati ya, anani b'merchavya. From my place of constriction, I called upon the Lord. God answered me expansively. The Israelites looked at their desert surroundings and saw no way forward, no way out, no exit. But God turned their wilderness home into the incubator of the solution to the real problem, which was to recreate Israel as a free nation under God with liberty and justice for all. We ought to reframe the Israelites' generation-long stay in the wilderness. True, the Bible reports it as God's anger, and no doubt it felt that way. But we should see it as a time of gestation. 40 years, that is to say a generation, is not an arbitrary period. It's not 2 minutes in the penalty box, as in an ice hockey infraction. The point of this timeout was to raise a generation in freedom. The greatest accomplishment of the Exodus generation was to raise their children without infecting the younger ones with their defeatism. They could only do that despite themselves. They could only do that in an alien environment where their own slavish instincts would be outweighed by the influence of the radically different conditions of life in which their children were growing up. That was no small accomplishment. Let's consider, as Americans, for how many generations the dysfunctionality inflicted upon the unwilling migrants from Africa has still plagued their descendants here in the United States. The Israelites accomplished in one generation what 5 generations since Juneteenth are still working at. The Bible is clear in its positive evaluation of the generation born in the wilderness. At the end of the book of Numbers, a reading that we get to this coming Shabbat, the Bible reports 2 incidents in which representatives of that generation demonstrate selflessness and altruism. First, the story of the daughters of Zelophehad. We remember them today as the 5 sisters who struck a blow for women's rights. Indeed, they were. But our own feminism makes it easy for us to overlook the conclusion of their story reported in the final chapter of the book of Numbers. Once they had secured the right to inherit their father's estate, they proceeded to marry their first cousins. That is to say, the very people who would have inherited the estate under the older law. The children produced in those marriages inherited the family farm, albeit from their mothers rather than from their fathers. But the net result was for the daughters to have engineered a change in the law without harming the parties being displaced. That is an amazing feat. Our own affirmative action in America, as needed as it is, does not achieve its results without such displacement. It is a tribute to the self-discipline and the altruism of these outstanding women. The second biblical testimonial to the altruism of the desert-born generation is the saga of the 2.5 tribes. Reported in Numbers chapter 32, the clans of Reuben, Gad, and half of Manasseh were ranchers. When the Israelites had conquered the Golan, adventitiously they weren't bent on conquering it, but they did so when the Syrian king attacked them unprovoked. These tribes asked Moses to be settled in the cattle country of the Golan rather than west of the Jordan. Moses was unhappy with them. Moses accused them of breaking faith with their people, but they responded with a generous counteroffer. They would fight on behalf of the other tribes until all had been settled. They made good on that promise. Only at the end of the conquest did they go home with Joshua's permission and blessing. What's more, the Reubenites built a sanctuary in their Transjordanian territory. The chief priest Pinchas accused them in words reminiscent of Moses' rebuke, but again, they gave a reassuring answer. Their sanctuary was not a replacement for the faith of Israel, but a memorial to God's rule, so that they would remain part of the covenant throughout the generations. This mollified Pinchas and again earned words of blessing. Reading the narratives of the Israelites of the wilderness period, we are struck by these repeated incidents where the children rise to levels that their parents never achieved. That's a testimonial to the revolution accomplished in the generation spanning the Sinai sojourn and the settlement in the Promised Land. Matzah chen bamidbar, as the Bible tells us, Israel found favor in the wilderness. Our time there made great things possible. And now a prayer for today. May we use our own generation's setbacks so wisely. May we turn today's reverses into the womb nurturing tomorrow's breakthroughs. Amen.